Previously, on part 1 of our White Mountains special. I drove halfway to the White Mountains and branched off the highway 30 miles north of Globe. After checking out the abandoned Regal asbestos mine from the air and checking out a mix of smooth and occasionally rough, narrow trails, I had made it to the edge of the Salt River Canyon where I camped out for the night. I got an early start and made it back to the highway at Seneca Lake. After another almost 3 hours of driving through Show Low, I finally made it to the heart of the White Mountains near Big Lake. Today, I continue with day 2 of my trip, heading south into the highest elevation sections of the Apache-sitgreaves National Forest, deep in the White Mountains. "30 minutes south of Highway 260, the highway continued to wind through meadows towards Big Lake. The elevation along this section was over 8,000 feet. I stopped off at Crescent Lake for a quick break and to grab a quick snack. Crescent Lake is one of 3 high mountain lakes in the area. Despite being so close to Big Lake, just a couple miles away, this spot is surprisingly secluded. Elk bugled in the distance, and hundreds of vibrant blue dragonflies lined the shore. In the distance was Mount Baldy, the second highest point in Arizona outside of the Flagstaff area, the highest sections of which were still covered in snow. Mount Baldy climbs up to 11,400 feet and by far is the highest point in all of the White Mountains. If you're into fishing, this would definitely be a place you want to check out, although it also makes for a great spot to stop and enjoy the view. After a quick break at Crescent Lake, I continued briefly along the paved road. Just a few miles later, I had made it back onto dirt roads and headed south on Forest Road 24. The road was wide and washboardy, but filled with all kinds of green colors. A few miles in, I branched off the main road and turned left onto some lesser forest roads. Even though I'd be on dirt for around the next 3 to 4 days, I stayed aired up at this point. Continuing east now, the trail was much narrower and bumpier. Despite it being midweek, the area already had quite a few people camped out in the different clearings. If you visit the White Mountains, this will likely be a common theme as the area is very popular for all kinds of outdoor enthusiasts. I made a hard left turn onto an even more isolated road and began to climb. This spur trail would switch back even higher into the forest as I made my way up Big Lake Knoll. The trail was easy to moderate, and I shortly found myself parked at the summit. Now over 9,400 feet, the 360-degree panorama was breathtaking, both figuratively and literally. The surrounding view offered a glimpse at the open expanse of the Apache-sitgreaves National Forest, as well as the lakes I had just passed. Mount Baldy rose up to the west, and Escudilla Mountain to the east. It was here on this summit where a fire tower was built in 1933 by the Civilian Conservation Corps. That tower, however, is noticeably not here anymore. The tower and much of the surrounding area was burned by the devastating wall of fire that ripped through this area back in 2011. The forest is slowly recovering, however, the fire damage is still extremely noticeable and would be seen throughout my entire trip. Only a few cement foundations remain today where the tower once stood. I grabbed lunch at the summit and admired the view. The weather was cool and mild. It was absolutely perfect. This point, as far as I know, marks the highest I had ever driven my Jeep in the state, so that was cool. It was now after 1 o'clock and I wanted to get back on the trail. Before getting underway, I decided to air down the tires real quick because I would pretty much be on dirt roads for the next 4 days. I headed back down the mountain on the narrow trail as it switched back into the forest. It was really incredible just how green this section was. At the bottom of the hill, I worked my way back to Forest Road 24 and eventually continued south. Back on the fast-moving road, it didn't take long for me to reach my next turnoff. The road split again, and I stayed onto a lesser forest road to the right. Staying left, Forest Road 24 continues to Buffalo Crossing, where it meets up with the East Fork of the Black River and other trail junctions. I'd be checking that area out in a couple of days, but for now, I wanted to see what was off on this side trail. The couple of miles along this section were certainly more isolated. The road was more washed out and more catered to high clearance vehicles, meaning it doesn't see as much traffic as the other roads I had been on. It did seem exceptionally dry along this section though. The seasonal streams that can occasionally flow through here were empty and it just didn't seem as green. Nevertheless, after only a couple of miles, the trail dumped me at Forest Road 25, just west of Buffalo Crossing. I continued on to the west. Now back on easy and smooth forest roads, I soon passed over the West Fork of the Black River. The West Fork originates higher up in the White Mountains near Mount Baldy. After twisting and turning its way through different meadows, it eventually crosses underneath this bridge and flows south, where not far from here, it converges with the East Fork. In total, the Black River flows 114 miles to the south and west, where it eventually meets up with the White River, and that eventually ends up in the Salt River, so really makes quite a journey as the water can reach as far as Phoenix, which is pretty much due west of this area. The cool water is popular with anglers and hikers, and makes for a relaxing spot to spend any amount of time. I would hopefully be camping along its banks, just a couple miles upstream later tonight. I pushed west as the forest briefly thinned, and I crossed through a couple of gorgeous meadows. This change of scenery was nice, and the trail remained smooth as I trucked along. I passed the turnoff for Caldwell Cabin, which is another rentable forest cabin that I have stayed in the past, which I would recommend checking out if it's available. On this trip, however, I'd be sticking to camping. After a few more miles, I turned north and briefly climbed before crossing the West Fork again. I pulled into West Fork Campground and followed it back, hoping to find a pristine spot for the night. West Fork Campground is an undeveloped area with several free sites scattered along the banks of the Black River. It features primitive bathrooms and fire rings, but that's about it as far as amenities go. About half of the campground is closed past the river crossing due to fire damage, but that's okay because at around 3 p.m. I had found the perfect spot. I parked the Jeep at the furthest point in the campground, just to the right of the vehicle barricades. I was extremely fortunate to be the only one in the campground for now. My campsite was located just feet away from the babbling river. With the river on one side and a thick forested hill on the other, this spot was surprisingly isolated for being in a campground. I got the tent opened up and slowly worked on getting the rest of camp ready. Because it was still early in the afternoon, I was able to take it easy and enjoy the sights and sounds, which there was no shortage of. After the sun was almost down, I got to work on dinner. Tonight would be burgers, or burger I suppose, since I was only making one. Dinner cooked up quick and was paired with a nice beer. Once it had finally gotten darker, I got to work on a fire. The fire ring was really the only thing that was provided at this campsite. After getting the fire going and some whiskey poured, it was now time to relax. The crackling of the fire, mixed with the river flowing nearby, proved to be the perfect combo. Today had been productive, driving nearly 200 miles from my campsite north of Globe and getting into the White Mountains for a nice, relaxing day. Underneath a vibrant night sky, the fire died down and I eventually made it up into the tent around 10 o'clock. The sound of the Black River lulled me right to sleep. "11 hours later, I was finally up and around. I had slept fantastic last night in what might have been the most relaxing night of camping in my life. The weather had dipped into the mid-40s, but overall wasn't too bad. I took a quick stroll over to the river. Yep, still relaxing. It would be extremely hard to leave this campsite. After getting the tent packed away, I started on a late breakfast, or I guess an early brunch. Oatmeal was accompanied by an over-easy egg and, of course, the obligatory cup of coffee. After a bite to eat, I got to work on cleaning up the rest of camp and loading the Jeep. I made sure my campfire was dead out, thanks to a little help from the nearby water source. It should go without saying, but always check and follow the local restrictions, and no matter what, make sure your campfire is cool to the touch before leaving. In a remote place like this, a fire can, as evidenced by the past, do some serious damage. With the Jeep now loaded up and some more traffic coming into the campground to access the river, it was time to get rolling. I drove south a few miles out of the campground, back across the West Fork, and eventually back to Forest Road 25. I turned right to continue east on the wide road. The plan for the day was to follow 25 all the way around, past Wildcat Point to its southern terminus near Hannigan Meadow. It was set to be another relaxing day, with a couple of stops at scenic viewpoints and a historic lookout tower. However, all of that would quickly change as some vehicle issues slowed me down and I was forced to revise my plans. Tune in next time to pick up part 3 of our White Mountains special. I'll visit the historic P.S. Knoll cabin and lookout tower and deal with my first ever trail fix deep in the back roads of the White Mountains. There will be more epic views, from a rugged lookout of the Black River to the truly shocking after effects of the wall of fire, as I continue to explore the area between Big Lake and Hannigan Meadow. We'll see you on the next one.